Nobody likes doomsday prophets or imagining the all-consuming apocalypse. Well, except maybe in movies. But no worries, we're not here to predict impending doom. Apocalypse isn't coming, not for 100 more seconds at least. Yeah, you heard that right. The doomsday clock has just been set to 100 seconds to midnight.
The doomsday clock is being set at 100 seconds to midnight. The fact that the doomsday clock hands now sit a mere 100 seconds from midnight signals really bad news indeed.
That basically means that according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and an organization of independent world leaders called the Elders, we're now closer to self-destruction than ever. How did that happen? The doomsday clock was invented right after World War II at the rise of the nuclear age. It serves as a symbol of man-made catastrophe.
We knew the world would not be the same. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
The closer it is to midnight, the more danger we're in from ourselves. Historically, the clock has been referred to as minutes to midnight, so it isn't great news for us that for the first time it's now counting in seconds. Back in the mid-20th century, people lived in almost constant fear of a nuclear attack, and they had good reason.
Always remember, the flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. And this is very, very important. Sometimes the bomb might explode without any warning. Without any warning.
The devastating effects of the two historic U.S. atomic bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, detonated in 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, showed the potential of mass destruction by these weapons. For years to come, nuclear weapons were being developed, tested, and threatened with, mainly to demonstrate the strength of nations. Though the clock appeared in the midst of nuclear fears in 1947, it was originally set to full 6 minutes to midnight. What's even more surprising is that the time was actually chosen completely randomly. In 1947, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists were getting ready to publish their first magazine issue. Founded a couple years prior by the scientists of the Manhattan Project, the world's first nuclear weapons initiative, the Bulletin strived to raise awareness about the dangers of the atomic age. Martha Langsdorff, an artist and the spouse of one of the project's scientists, Alexander Langsdorff, was tasked with the design of the cover, aiming to illustrate the urgency in dealing with the potentially devastating nuclear technologies. Martha devised the clock. With just a few minutes left until midnight, the clock illustrated how little time we had to get the situation under control. What started as an artistic drawing on a magazine's cover soon grew to be much more than that. Minutes to midnight proved to be a great metaphor and was used to inform the public about the nuclear threats in the years to come. Though the original clock setting was never meant to be moved, anywhere really, in 1949 the Bulletin decided to move it forward for the first time. The year marked a dangerous milestone for the atomic age and the Cold War. The Soviet Union had made and tested its first nuclear bomb. While the public in the US were advised to stay calm, even the nature of the USSR's atomic explosion was being covered up. The Bulletin felt the need to speak out. The clock was, for the first time, moved considerably closer to 3 minutes to midnight. We do not advise Americans that doomsday is near and that they can expect atomic bombs to start falling on their heads a month or a year from now, they said. But we think they have a reason to be deeply alarmed and to be prepared for grave decisions. The Bulletin stuck to their mission to keep the public informed and moved the clock forward again in 1953. That's when the hydrogen bombs, an even more devastating threat, came on the market in both US and USSR. The clock showed a dangerous 2 minutes to midnight. The hands of the clock of doom have moved again, the Bulletin announced. Only a few more swings of the pendulum, and from Moscow to Chicago, atomic explosions will strike midnight for Western civilization. But the doomsday clock is no usual clock. Luckily for us, it can be turned back. And despite the ongoing Cold War, the Bulletin deemed it safe to turn the clock's minute setting back in 1960 and then again in 1963. In both of these cases, the apocalypse was delayed because the US and the Soviet Union finally started talking. Though it took a while to sink in, the power nations had realized the horror of full-scale nuclear war, and for the first time, they started cooperating instead. In recognition of these new hopeful elements in the world picture, we're moving the clock of doom on the bulletin's cover a few minutes back from midnight, said the bulletin in 1960. A series of political decisions made cooperation seem more likely than confrontation. These hopes were strengthened when the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963 by the two countries, banning all atmospheric nuclear testing.
In an age when both sides have come to possess enough nuclear power to destroy the human race several times over.
That landed us at the farthest from apocalypse yet, at 12 minutes to midnight. Despite a few back and forths in the coming years, the clock stayed relatively far away from midnight for almost 2 decades. During this time, the US and USSR also signed additional agreements to strengthen nuclear arms control. Meanwhile, the world at large came together to sign an international nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which meant to limit nuclear weapons and encourage cooperation in nuclear energy. But things started to unravel again in the late 1970s, and by 1981, the clock's minute hand had drawn to a dangerous 4 minutes to midnight. For a few years, it turned out, the two of the world's superpowers had been modernizing instead of eliminating their nuclear weapons industry. Moreover, the leaders of both the US and the Soviet Union were openly declaring that nuclear war as thinkable and one that could be won. The Cold War reheated. The clock's minute hand had moved 1 more minute towards midnight in 1984 at the iciest point of US-USSR relations. But as the old saying goes, if you hit rock bottom, the only way is up. Or nuclear annihilation, possibly. Something the wisdom of the elders didn't account for. Fortunately, the latter wasn't the case. And the leaders of the two nations found a way to reach an agreement again. Largely due to the efforts of then US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed, banning all land-based nuclear missiles. The clock rewound again to 6 minutes to midnight in 1988.
A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
6, 10, 17 minutes to midnight. Due to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the official end of the Cold War, the doomsday clock was set to a comfortable 17 minutes to midnight in 1991. The US and Soviet leaders signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, famously known as START. We feel the world has entered a new era, the bulletin said. The illusion that tens of thousands of nuclear weapons are a guarantor of national security has been stripped away.
The only winning mood is not to play.
Sadly, this lull period didn't last, and it's been downhill ever since. If we fast forward to more recent times, it's kind of chilling to realize we seem to be moving in reverse. The world is not keeping to the terms of international treaties as other countries start to develop and test nuclear weapons. The US and Russia continue to set a bad example by continuing to hold massive amounts of nuclear weapons. After 9/11, the Americans became increasingly concerned about nuclear materials falling into the hands of terrorists. At the same time, US leaders express a desire for new-grade nuclear weapons. A number of nuclear control treaties are rejected. Finally, the US withdrawals from the anti-ballistic missile treaty that was signed with the Soviet Union in 1972. There's a flicker of hope again in 2010, when Washington and Moscow enter talks for a follow-on agreement to START. But a new global issue comes into play. Climate change. We can no longer prevent global warming. It is upon us, says the bulletin. If we continue business as usual, our habitat could be disrupted beyond recognition, with consequences for our way of life that we cannot now foresee. The clock is ticking. Fast forward a few years, and the Earth endures its hottest year on record. But instead of focusing on climate change, The world's most powerful countries are yet again modernizing their nuclear industry and undermining the existing treaties. The bulletin warns about threats of AI and cyber attacks. Careless rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons and the wanton defiance of scientific truths lands us a half step closer to doomsday again in 2017. Fake news, autonomous weapons, and other emerging technologies enter the doomsday arena. In 2018, the clock reaches 2 minutes before midnight, a setting so low matched only by the hydrogen bombs in 1953. World leaders failed to respond effectively to the looming threats of nuclear war and climate change, making the world security situation as dangerous as it has ever been since World War II, the 2018 clock announcement says. The US and Russia continue to avoid nuclear negotiations and are upgrading their nuclear arsenals, further undermining existing treaties. An extension to the historic START seems less and less likely. North Korea continues to grow as a nuclear threat. No country signed the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons proposed by the United Nations.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
In the meantime, the US government continues to derail past US climate policies, and climate change denialists are hard at work with sophisticated disinformation campaigns. In 2019, the bulletin calls the ongoing situation a new abnormal. Finally, we arrive at 2020, and the clock has reached the lowest point it's ever been at, 100 seconds to midnight. Failure to deal with the clock's looming warnings over the years seems to have got us here, as well as undoing all the good work of governments of the past. But there's still hope. According to the bulletin, and as we've found, the doomsday clock can in fact be rewound. The bulletin's advice? Science provides the world's searchlight in times of fog and confusion. The clock is ticking.